the day Thaddeus Owens rode into Greeley, Colorado territory in the late summer of 1873. He witnessed a woman collapse in the middle of the dirt road, and something inside his chest twisted hard enough to make him forget he had sworn off civilized towns forever. The woman was thin, her dress more patches than original fabric, and when she tried to push herself up from the dusty street, her arms gave out beneath her. Thaddeus pulled his horse to a stop and swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that sent up small clouds of dust. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick with muscle from years of hauling traps and felling trees in the mountains. His dark hair hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was trimmed close enough to be respectable but wild enough to mark him as a man who lived far from society. Nobody else stopped to help the woman. A few townspeople glanced her way and kept walking, as if seeing someone fall from exhaustion was as common as seeing a tumbleweed blow down the street. Thaddeus knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her prone form, and when he gently touched her shoulder, she flinched away with a gasp. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "I mean you no harm." She turned her face toward him, and despite the dirt smudged across her cheeks and the exhaustion evident in every line of her body, he found himself looking into the most striking pair of blue eyes he had ever seen. They were the color of mountain lakes in springtime, clear and deep and full of something he could not quite name. Intelligence, maybe, or defiance. Perhaps both. "I am fine," she said, though her voice was weak and her body trembled. "Please just leave me be." "You are not fine," Thaddeus said matter-of-factly. "When did you last eat?" She did not answer, but the way her gaze dropped told him everything he needed to know. He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and another under her knees, lifting her as easily as he might lift a child. She weighed almost nothing, all sharp angles and bones beneath the worn fabric of her dress. "Put me down," she protested, but there was no strength behind the words. "I do not need charity." "This is not charity," he said, carrying her toward the boardwalk. "This is common decency, which seems to be in short supply in this town." He could feel her heart beating like a frightened bird against her ribcage. Her hands were small and rough when they gripped his shirt, and he noticed the dirt caked under her nails, the calluses on her palms. These were not the hands of a lady who had fallen on temporary hard times. These were the hands of someone who had been fighting to survive for a long while. The restaurant was small and smelled of fried meat and coffee. The proprietor, a stout man with a balding head and suspicious eyes, looked up from wiping down a table and frowned. "We do not serve her kind here," he said flatly. Thaddeus felt his jaw tighten. He set the woman carefully on a chair near the door and then straightened to his full height, fixing the proprietor with a stare that had once made a black bear think twice about approaching his camp. "Her kind," he said quietly, dangerously. "And what kind would that be?" The proprietor shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. "Now look here, mister, I do not want any trouble, but she has got no money and I am running a business, not a charity house." Thaddeus reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, slapping it down on the counter hard enough to make the proprietor jump. "Bring her food, soup, bread, whatever you have that is hot and filling, and coffee, strong coffee." The proprietor looked at the coin, then at Thaddeus, and evidently decided that arguing was not worth the potential consequences. He nodded and disappeared into the back room, leaving Thaddeus alone with the woman. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from her, noting the way she kept her eyes downcast, the way her hands twisted together in her lap. Now that he could see her in better light, He realized she was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. Her hair was a light brown, almost blonde where the sun had touched it, but it was pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to flatter her features. Still, beneath the grime and exhaustion, he could see the fine bones of her face, the elegant line of her neck. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if even this small piece of information was too valuable to give away freely. Fiona Fletcher, Thaddeus Owens." He extended his hand across the table. She looked at it for a long moment before reaching out to shake it. Her grip was surprisingly firm despite her weakened state. "Thank you for the meal, Mr. Owens. I will pay you back when I am able." "No need," he said. "Where are you staying?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "I have a place." It was clearly a lie, but he did not press. The proprietor returned with a bowl of beef stew, thick with vegetables and potatoes, along with a chunk of dark bread and a steaming cup of coffee. Fiona stared at the food as if she could not quite believe it was real. "Go on," Thaddeus urged. "Eat before it gets cold." She picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took a small bite, then another, and then she was eating with the desperate hunger of someone who had gone far too long without food. Thaddeus watched her, feeling that strange twist in his chest again. He had come to Greeley to sell his winter's worth of pelts and buy supplies before heading back into the mountains. He had planned to be in town for 2 days at most, conduct his business and leave. He did not like towns, did not like the noise and the smell and the way people looked at him like he was something wild and dangerous. But looking at Fiona Fletcher, watching the way color slowly returned to her pale cheeks as she ate, he felt something shift inside him. It was like the moment when ice on a frozen lake began to crack at the first touch of spring warmth, that subtle but unmistakable change that signaled the start of something new. "How long have you been in Greeley?" he asked when she had finished half the bowl and some of the desperation had left her eating. 3 months, she said quietly. "I came west with a wagon train. My father had heard there was opportunity here, land to be claimed, a chance to start fresh." "Where is your father now?" The look that crossed her face told him the answer before she spoke. "Dead. Cholera took him 2 weeks after we arrived, and my mother had died on the trail back in Kansas." "I am sorry," Thaddeus said, and meant it. "Do you have other family?" "No." She said it simply, as if it were just a fact of life rather than a tragedy. "It has been just me since then. I have been looking for work, but nobody in this town wants to hire a woman with no skills and no references. I tried doing laundry, but the woman who owns the laundry told me I was taking business from her and ran me off. I tried to get work at the hotel, but the owner said I looked too rough for his establishment." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I look rough because I have been sleeping in an old shed behind the livery stable, washing my clothes in the creek, and eating whatever scraps I can find or afford. It is a cruel circle, Mr. Owens." Thaddeus felt anger building in his gut, hot and fierce. Not at her, but at the town, at the people who had walked past her in the street, at the injustice of a world where a woman could be left to starve simply because she had no money and no family to protect her. "Can you ride a horse?" he asked abruptly. She looked up at him, confusion clear in those blue eyes. "What? Can you ride a horse?" he repeated. "I suppose so. I mean, I rode in a wagon for months. I have been on a horse before, though it has been some time." "Can you cook, clean, mend clothes?" "Yes, but I do not understand what you are asking." Thaddeus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I live up in the mountains about 15 miles north of here. I have a cabin, good-sized, with a loft and a proper fireplace. I spend most of my time trapping and hunting, and I will be honest with you, the place is not fit for civilized company. I do my own cooking, which mostly amounts to roasting whatever meat I have caught over the fire. I do my own mending, which means half my clothes have more holes than fabric. And I do my own cleaning, which I will admit does not happen as often as it probably should. He paused, watching her face carefully. I am offering you a job, Miss Fletcher. I need someone to keep house, cook proper meals, mend my clothes, and tend to the cabin while I am out on the trap lines. In exchange, I will provide room and board and wages on top of that. $5 a month to start, more if things work out. Fiona stared at him as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. You want to hire me, but you do not know me. I could be a thief or a liar or worse. Could be, Thaddeus agreed, but I do not think you are. I think you are a woman who has had nothing but bad luck and hard times and who deserves a chance to get back on her feet. Why? She asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice, something that made him think she was not just asking why he would hire her, but why he would care at all. Why would you help me? It was a good question, one he was not entirely sure he could answer. He had been living alone in the mountains for 5 years, ever since his parents had died in a house fire back in Missouri. He had wanted nothing to do with other people, preferring the company of trees and rivers and wild animals. He was not a man given to acts of charity or sentimentality. And yet, when he had seen her fall in that street, when he had looked into her eyes and seen that stubborn spark of will refusing to be extinguished, despite everything life had thrown at her, something inside him had recognized something inside her. Let us just say I know what it is like to be alone in the world, he said finally. And I do not think anyone should have to face that without at least one person willing to lend a hand. Tears welled up in Fiona's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously, clearly embarrassed. I accept, she said quietly. And I promise you, Mr. Owens, I will work harder than any person you have ever met. You will not regret this. I do not think I will, he said, and realized he meant it. They spent that night in town. Thaddeus rented 2 rooms at the hotel, one for himself and one for Fiona, ignoring the disapproving looks from the clerk. He also took her to the general store and bought her a new dress, a practical calico that would hold up better than the rags she was wearing, along with a sturdy pair of boots, a warm shawl, and a few other necessities. She protested every purchase, insisting it was too much, but he waved away her objections. Cannot have my housekeeper walking around in clothes that will fall apart at the first stiff breeze, he said gruffly. Consider it an investment in my own comfort. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn in the air. Thaddeus loaded up his pack horse with supplies from the general store, flour and sugar and coffee and salt, along with ammunition for his rifles and new traps to replace the ones that had broken over the winter. Fiona emerged from the hotel wearing her new dress, her hair brushed and pinned back more neatly than before, and he felt his breath catch slightly. Clean and rested, she looked entirely different. The exhaustion had faded from her eyes, replaced by a nervous excitement, and without the layers of dirt obscuring her features, he could see that she was actually quite lovely. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his hand to help her mount his spare horse. "As I will ever be," she said, taking his hand and swinging up into the saddle with more grace than he had expected. They rode north out of Greeley, following the Cache la Powder River up into the foothills. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills covered in pine and aspen. Thaddeus kept the pace easy, mindful of the fact that Fiona was still recovering her strength and probably not accustomed to long hours in the saddle. She did not complain, though, just kept her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins. "How did you come to live up here?" she asked after they had been riding for a few hours. Needed to get away from people, he said simply. After my parents died, I found I did not have much use for towns and settlements. Too many memories, too many folks thinking they knew what was best for me. So I packed what I could carry and headed west. Found this spot about 5 years back, built my cabin, and have been here ever since. Do you not get lonely? He considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted. But I prefer loneliness to the alternative. People are complicated. The mountains are simple. A bear is a bear, a river is a river. They do not lie or cheat or pretend to be something they are not. That is a rather cynical view of humanity, Mr. Owens. Maybe so, but it is an honest one. He glanced over at her. What about you? Why did your father want to come west? He had dreams, she said, and there was a wistful quality to her voice. He was a shopkeeper back in Pennsylvania, and he always felt like he was meant for something more. When the war ended and they started opening up the territories, he got it into his head that we should claim some land and start fresh. My mother did not want to go, but she loved him, so she agreed. And I loved them both, so I came along. You do not sound entirely convinced it was a good idea. I was not, she admitted. I liked our life back east. It was safe, predictable, but I was young and naive, and I thought that was a bad thing. I thought adventure and excitement were what mattered. Now, I know that safety and predictability have their own value. They lapsed into silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes between two people who have reached an understanding. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the trail, and the air smelled of pine sap and dry earth. Thaddeus found himself watching Fiona from the corner of his eye, noting the way she sat her horse, the way she looked around at the landscape with cautious curiosity. The cabin came into view as the sun was starting to sink toward the western peaks. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a creek running along one side and a view of the higher mountains in the distance. It was built of sturdy logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch across the front. There was a small barn for the horses and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin. It was not much, but Thaddeus had built it with his own hands, and he was proud of it. Fiona dismounted and stood looking at the cabin, and he tried to see it through her eyes. The porch was cluttered with traps and tools, the windows needed cleaning, and there was a general air of neglect that spoke to a man living alone without much concern for appearances. It needs work, he said, feeling oddly defensive. It has good bones, she said diplomatically. Then she turned to look at him, and there was a smile on her face, small but genuine. And it is beautiful up here, truly beautiful. He felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest at her words. Come on, he said, grabbing the packs from the horses. Let me show you inside. The interior of the cabin was dark until he lit the oil lamps, and then it sprang into view. There was a large main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with the fireplace dominating one wall. A table and 2 chairs sat near the window, and shelves lined the walls, holding various supplies and equipment. A ladder led up to a loft where Thaddeus kept his bedroll. In the back corner was a smaller room, barely more than a closet, that he had intended to use for storage but had never gotten around to organizing. That can be your room, he said, gesturing to the small space. It is not much, but it is private. I will need to build you a proper bed frame, but for tonight, I can set up a pallet with some blankets. Fiona walked slowly through the cabin, running her fingers along the rough wood of the table, examining the shelves, peering up at the loft. Her expression was unreadable. What do you think? He asked, suddenly anxious for her approval. I think it is the nicest place I have been in 3 months, she said quietly. And I think you are right that it needs work, But Mr. Owens, I also think it could be a real home with a little care and attention." Something about the way she said home made his throat tighten. He cleared it roughly and turned away, busying himself with unloading the supplies. "Well, that is what I am paying you for. Make it however you see fit. Just do not throw out anything important." "What exactly would qualify as important?" she asked, and he could hear the amusement in her voice. "The rifles, the traps, my knives, and my coffee pot. Everything else is fair game." Over the next few weeks, Fiona transformed the cabin in ways Thaddeus would not have thought possible. She scrubbed every surface until the wood gleamed, organized the chaotic shelves into some semblance of order, and sewed curtains for the windows out of fabric she had somehow coaxed him into buying on another trip to town. She turned the root cellar into a proper pantry, arranging the supplies by type and making a list of what they would need before winter set in. She washed all the clothes and linens, mended everything that had holes, and even managed to patch the roof where it had been leaking. But it was the cooking that truly amazed him. Thaddeus had been living on roasted meat, beans, and the occasional potato for years. Fiona took the same basic ingredients and turned them into meals he had not known were possible. She made stews that were rich and complex, bread that was soft and golden, pies from the wild berries she foraged near the creek. She even figured out how to make a decent cup of tea from pine needles and mint that grew in the shade behind the cabin. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked one evening, savoring a bowl of venison stew that had more flavor than anything he could remember eating. "My mother taught me," she said, sitting down across from him with her own bowl. "She was very particular about meals. She said that a good meal was one of life's simple pleasures, and that even in hard times, it was worth the effort to make food that nourished both body and soul." She was a wise woman. She was. Fiona's expression grew distant. "I wish she could have lived to see the mountains." She would have loved it here. They had fallen into an easy routine. Thaddeus would wake before dawn and head out to check his trap lines, sometimes not returning until well after dark. Fiona would spend her days working in and around the cabin, cooking, cleaning, and preparing for the winter that was slowly approaching. In the evenings, they would eat dinner together, and then sit by the fire while she mended clothes or worked on some other project and he cleaned his guns or sharpened his knives. It was a peaceful existence, and Thaddeus found himself looking forward to those evenings more than he cared to admit. Fiona was easy to talk to, with a quick wit and a sharp mind. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, about the mountains, about the animals he encountered. And when he asked about her life before coming west, she spoke with honesty and a lack of self-pity that he admired. She also was not afraid to challenge him when she thought he was wrong, which he found both frustrating and refreshing. When he suggested that they did not need to stock up on quite so much firewood, she had fixed him with a stern look and said, "Mr. Owens, I may be new to the mountains, but I am not a fool. Winter up here will be harsh, and I will not have us freezing because you were too stubborn to cut enough wood." He had cut the extra wood. As September turned into October, the aspen trees exploded into gold and the nights grew cold enough to frost. Thaddeus found himself increasingly aware of Fiona's presence in ways that had nothing to do with her skills as a housekeeper. He noticed the way the lamplight caught in her hair, turning it to honey. He noticed the grace in her movements, even when she was doing something as mundane as sweeping the floor. He noticed the sound of her humming as she worked, soft and tuneless but oddly comforting. And he noticed the way his heart seemed to beat a little faster when she smiled at him. It was a dangerous thing, this growing awareness. Fiona was his employee, dependent on him for her livelihood. She had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. The last thing he wanted was to make her feel uncomfortable or pressured in any way. So he kept his feelings to himself, locked away behind the same walls he had built around his heart 5 years ago. But those walls were starting to crack. One afternoon in mid-October, Thaddeus returned from checking his traps to find Fiona in the clearing behind the cabin, splitting wood. She had taken off her shawl and rolled up her sleeves, and he could see the muscles in her arms working as she swung the axe. Her face was flushed with exertion, and there were wood chips in her hair, but she looked alive in a way he had never seen before. She looked like she belonged here in these mountains, in this wild, beautiful place. She looked like she belonged with him. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and he stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, just watching her. She had not noticed him yet, too focused on her task. He watched as she bent to position another log, watched as she lifted the axe and brought it down with surprising force, watched as the log split cleanly in two. When she straightened and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dirt across her skin, he felt something inside him give way entirely. She was beautiful. Not despite the dirt and the work and the rough clothes, but because of them. She had survived things that would have broken many people, and instead of becoming bitter or defeated, she had remained strong and determined. She wore rags and had dirt under her nails, but when he looked at her, he saw a queen. He saw courage and grace, and a kind of quiet nobility that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with the content of her character. And he knew, with sudden and absolute certainty, that he was falling in love with her. "Are you going to stand there staring, or are you going to help?" Fiona called out, having finally spotted him. Thaddeus shook himself and walked over, taking the axe from her hands. "This is heavy work. You should have waited for me to get back." "I am perfectly capable of splitting wood," she said, a note of defensiveness in her voice. "I may not be as strong as you, but I am not helpless." "I know you are not helpless," he said quietly, "but that does not mean you have to do everything yourself. We are partners here, Fiona. Let me help you." Something in his tone made her pause, and she looked up at him with those clear blue eyes searching his face. "Partners," she repeated softly. "I like that." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken, and Thaddeus felt his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to tell her what he was feeling, wanted to pull her into his arms and kiss her until neither of them could breathe. But he forced himself to step back, to break the moment before he did something foolish. "Go on inside and rest," he said gruffly. "I will finish this." She hesitated, then nodded and walked toward the cabin. Thaddeus threw himself into the work, splitting log after log with more force than was strictly necessary, trying to work out the restless energy that had taken hold of him. By the time he finished, his arms were aching and his shirt was soaked with sweat, but he felt marginally more in control. When he came inside, Fiona had dinner waiting, a rich elk stew with root vegetables and fresh bread still warm from the oven. They ate in silence at first, but it was not the comfortable silence they had shared before. There was a tension in the air now, an awareness that had not been there earlier. "Fiona," he said finally, setting down his spoon, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, her expression guarded. "All right. Are you happy here? I mean truly happy, not just grateful to have a roof over your head and food on the table. Do you like living here in the mountains, away from other people?" She seemed surprised by the question. "Yes," she said slowly. "I did not expect to, if I am being honest. I thought I would miss having neighbors, miss being part of a community, but I find I do not. There is a peace here that I never found in towns, a simplicity. I wake up and know what needs to be done, and I do it, and at the end of the day I can see the results of my work. It is satisfying in a way nothing else has ever been." "And what about the isolation? Does it bother you that we are so far from other people?" Now her eyes narrowed slightly. "Where are these questions coming from, Mr. Owens?" He took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line but unable to stop himself. "I am asking because I need to know if this arrangement is something you want for the long term. If this is a life you could see yourself living not just for a few months but for years, maybe forever." The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Fiona set down her own spoon very carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "Why does it matter?" "It matters," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I am developing feelings for you, Fiona Fletcher. Feelings that go well beyond what an employer should feel for his employee. And before I say or do anything that might make you uncomfortable, I need to know if there is any chance, any possibility at all, that you might feel the same way." For a long moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she rose from her chair and walked around the table to where he sat. She stopped in front of him, so close that he could smell the scent of bread and wood smoke that clung to her skin. "You want to know if I have feelings for you?" she asked quietly. "Mr. Owens, I have been falling for you since the day you picked me up off that street in Greeley. Every act of kindness, every moment of respect, every evening we have spent together by this fire has only deepened what I feel. I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, but I have never been very good at lying to myself." Thaddeus stood, his chair scraping against the wood floor. They were standing so close now that he could feel the heat radiating from her body. "Say it plain," he said hoarsely. "I need to hear you say it plain." "I am in love with you, Thaddeus Owens," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I love your strength and your kindness. I love the way you see me as an equal, not as someone lesser or weaker. I love the life we have built here together. And if you were to ask me to stay, not as your employee but as something more, I would say yes without hesitation." The last of his control snapped. He cupped her face in his large hands, marveling at how delicate she felt, and then he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he held on too tight. But then she made a soft sound in the back of her throat and pressed closer, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thaddeus rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said roughly. "I did not think I was capable of loving anyone anymore, but you have proved me wrong. You have brought light back into my life, Fiona. You have made this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep, and I do not want to go back to the way things were before." "Then do not," she whispered. "We will go forward together." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the taste of her, the feel of her in his arms. When he pulled back, he saw tears streaming down her cheeks, and he wiped them away gently with his thumbs. "Why are you crying?" "Because I am happy," she said, laughing through her tears. "For the first time in so long, I am truly, completely happy. I thought my life was over when my parents died, thought I would spend whatever time I had left just trying to survive. But you gave me something to live for again. You gave me hope." They stood there in the middle of the cabin, holding each other as the fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind whistled through the pines outside. Thaddeus felt as if the pieces of himself that had been scattered and broken were finally coming back together, knitting into something whole and strong. "We should do this proper," he said after a while. "I want to marry you, Fiona. I want you to be my wife, not just in spirit but in law. Will you have me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes." They rode down to Greeley a week later on a crisp October morning when the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. Fiona wore her best dress, the calico that Thaddeus had bought her, and she had woven wildflowers into her hair. Thaddeus had trimmed his beard and put on his cleanest shirt, and he rode with a lightness in his chest that he had forgotten was possible. The preacher was a somber man named Reverend Clark, who ran a small church on the outskirts of town. He seemed surprised when Thaddeus and Fiona showed up asking to be married, but he agreed readily enough when Thaddeus offered him $5 for the service. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the empty church with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. But when Thaddeus slipped a simple gold band onto Fiona's finger, a ring he had bought from the jeweler in town that morning, he felt as if he was making a vow that went deeper than any words could express. He was promising to love her, protect her, and cherish her for all the days of his life. And when Fiona looked up at him, her eyes shining with joy, he knew she was making the same promise. They spent their wedding night at the hotel in Greeley, in a room that seemed almost absurdly civilized after months of living in the cabin. But Thaddeus barely noticed the surroundings. All he was aware of was Fiona, his wife, lying in his arms as the lamplight played across her skin. They made love with a tenderness that surprised him, given the hunger he had been feeling for weeks. But this was not just about physical need. This was about connection, about two souls recognizing each other and choosing to become one. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under the clean hotel sheets, Fiona traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "Tell me about your parents," she said softly. It was a request he would have refused from anyone else, but he found he wanted to share this with her. "My father was a blacksmith," he said. "Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. He believed in hard work and honest dealing, and he taught me that a man's word was his bond. My mother was quieter, but she had a will of iron under all that gentleness. She kept the household running, kept my father from working himself to death, and made sure I grew up knowing how to read and write and do arithmetic. They sound wonderful. They were. The fire that killed them started in the shop. My father went back in to try to save his tools, his life's work. My mother went in after him. By the time the neighbors managed to put out the flames, it was too late for either of them." His voice was rough with old grief. "I was at a friend's house when it happened. I came home to find nothing but ashes." Fiona pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "I am so sorry. It was a long time ago, but it changed me. Made me realize how fragile everything is, how quickly it can all be taken away. That is why I came out here to the mountains. I thought if I did not let myself care about anything, I could not be hurt again." "But that is not really living, is it?" she said gently. "That is just existing." "No," he agreed. "It is not living, but I did not know any other way. Not until I met you." She raised herself up on one elbow to look down at him. "You saved my life that day in Greeley, Thaddeus, but I think maybe I saved yours too, just in a different way." "You did," he said, pulling her down for a kiss. "You absolutely did." They returned to the cabin the next day to find the first snow of the season dusting the peaks in the distance. Fiona laughed with delight when she saw it, and Thaddeus felt his heart swell with love for this woman, who could find joy in something as simple as snow on the mountains. The winter that followed was long and harsh, with storms that sometimes lasted for days and temperatures that dropped so low the creek froze solid. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and light and laughter. Thaddeus and Fiona settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked together during the day, Thaddeus tending his trap lines when the weather allowed while Fiona managed the cabin and the supplies. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, or read from the few books Thaddeus owned, or simply enjoy each other's company in comfortable silence. And at night, in the loft that had become their shared bedroom, they discovered each other with a passion that never seemed to diminish. Thaddeus marveled at how Fiona could be both strong and soft, fierce and gentle. She challenged him, made him think, made him want to be a better man. And she told him that he made her feel safe and valued and loved in a way she had never experienced before. As winter gave way to spring, they began to talk about the future. Fiona wanted to plant a garden, to have fresh vegetables to supplement their diet of meat and foraged foods. Thaddeus wanted to expand the cabin, to add another room for when they eventually had children. They spoke of these things with the easy confidence of two people who knew they would face whatever came together. In May, Fiona told him she was pregnant. Thaddeus had been checking over his traps in preparation for summer, when hunting and trapping would slow down, and he dropped the trap he was holding when she spoke the words. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I have missed my monthly courses for 2 months now, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. There is no doubt." He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We are having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "We are," she agreed, cupping his face in her hands. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said, kissing her soundly. "You have given me everything, Fiona, a home, a purpose, and now a family. I could not ask for anything more." The pregnancy was not easy. Fiona suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and Thaddeus found himself helpless in the face of her discomfort. He tried to make things easier for her, taking over more of the household chores, making sure she rested as much as possible. But Fiona was stubborn, insisting that she was pregnant, not an invalid, and refusing to be coddled. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time," she told him when he suggested she should spend the day resting instead of working in her garden. "I am not made of glass, Thaddeus. I can handle a little morning sickness." But as summer turned to fall and her belly began to swell with their child, even Fiona had to admit that she needed help. Thaddeus made another trip to Greeley, this time to find a midwife who would be willing to come stay with them for the last month of the pregnancy and the birth. He found a capable woman named Mrs. Harriet Simmons, who had delivered more babies than she could count, and who agreed to make the journey up the mountain for a generous fee. Mrs. Simmons arrived in late October, just as the leaves were turning gold and the first hints of winter were appearing in the air. She was a stout woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Fiona, pronounced her healthy and strong, and set about preparing for the birth with brisk efficiency. "First babies can take their time," she told Thaddeus, who was hovering anxiously. "Could be another month yet before the little one decides to make an appearance. Best thing you can do is stay out of the way and let your wife rest." Staying out of the way proved to be impossible for Thaddeus. He found excuses to check on Fiona constantly, bringing her water, adjusting her pillows, asking if she needed anything. She bore his fussing with good humor, though Mrs. Simmons finally took pity on him and sent him out to chop firewood, saying they would need plenty for the birth and the recovery afterward. The baby came on a cold November night, arriving with the first serious snowstorm of the season. Fiona's labor started just after dinner, and for the next 12 hours, Thaddeus paced the length of the cabin while Mrs. Simmons and Fiona worked in the small bedroom. He could hear Fiona crying out with pain, and it took every ounce of willpower he possessed not to burst through that door and demand to be let in. Finally, just as dawn was breaking and the snow was beginning to let up, he heard a new sound. A thin, reedy wail that made his heart stop and then race. Mrs. Simmons opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy, strong boy with a good set of lungs, and your wife did beautifully. She is exhausted, but she is fine." Thaddeus barely heard anything past. "You have a son." He rushed past Mrs. Simmons into the bedroom, where Fiona lay propped up against the pillows, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when he entered, and the smile on her face was radiant despite her obvious exhaustion. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Thaddeus approached the bed as if in a dream. When Fiona pulled back the blanket to reveal the baby's face, he felt his knees go weak. The baby was tiny, red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on the world around him. He was the most beautiful thing Thaddeus had ever seen. "Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course. He is your son." Thaddeus took the baby in his large hands, cradling him against his chest with infinite care. The baby made a small sound and turned his face toward Thaddeus, as if already recognizing his father. Thaddeus felt tears streaming down his face, and he made no effort to stop them. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your father, and I promise you I will do everything in my power to give you a good life. You will grow up knowing you are loved and wanted. You will never have to doubt that." Fiona reached out and took his hand. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking down at his son, Thaddeus knew what the boy's name should be. "Thomas," he said, "after my father, Thomas Fletcher Owens." "It is perfect," Fiona said, squeezing his hand. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." The weeks after Thomas's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, and the strange, overwhelming love that came with being responsible for such a tiny, helpless creature. Mrs. Simmons stayed for 2 weeks, teaching Fiona how to nurse the baby and helping with the household chores while Fiona recovered. Then she packed up her things and rode back down to Greeley, leaving Thaddeus and Fiona to figure out parenthood on their own. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he woke every few hours to eat, and his cries could shake the rafters. Thaddeus, who had faced down bears and mountain lions without flinching, found himself paralyzed with fear every time his son sneezed or coughed. But Fiona took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. She learned to nurse while half asleep, to change diapers with one hand while stirring a pot with the other, to soothe a crying baby with a patience that seemed endless. And slowly, Thaddeus learned too. He learned how to hold his son properly, how to rock him to sleep, how to make silly faces that would earn him a toothless smile. Winter passed, then spring, then summer. Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, active baby who laughed at everything and had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. Fiona's garden flourished, providing them with fresh vegetables to supplement the meat Thaddeus brought in from his hunting. The cabin, which had once seemed too large for one person, now felt exactly the right size for a family. One evening in late summer, when Thomas was 9 months old and starting to pull himself up on the furniture, Thaddeus and Fiona sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Thomas was asleep in Fiona's arms, his small fist clutching her shirt. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not stopped that day in Greeley?" Thaddeus asked. Fiona was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in the way you might think. I do not wonder what would have happened if you had not helped me. I wonder why you did. Of all the people who walked past me that day, you were the only one who stopped. Why?" "I have asked myself the same question," Thaddeus said. "I think it was because I saw something in you even then. A strength, a refusal to give up even when giving up would have been the easier choice. You reminded me that there was still good in the world, still people worth caring about." "You saw a queen underneath all the struggle," Fiona said softly, repeating words he had once said to her in a moment of tenderness. "I did. I do. You are the strongest, most remarkable person I have ever known, Fiona, and I fall more in love with you every single day." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to wake the baby. "I love you too, and I love the life we have built here. It is not easy, and it is not what I imagined for myself when I was a girl back in Pennsylvania. But it is ours, and it is good, and I would not trade it for anything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called out. The creek burbled along its course. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging against the darkening sky. As fall arrived again and Thomas celebrated his first birthday, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with joy but also a certain calm confidence. They knew what to expect now, knew they could handle whatever came. Mrs. Simmons agreed to return when the time came, and Thaddeus began making plans to add that extra room to the cabin, knowing they would need the space. The second baby, a girl they named Sarah after Fiona's mother, arrived on a sunny day in May. She was smaller than Thomas had been, but just as healthy, with her mother's blonde hair and a temperament that seemed remarkably peaceful. Thomas, now a toddler who could walk and was starting to form words, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly trying to touch her soft hair and pat her cheeks with his chubby hands. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before, but rich with meaning. Thaddeus found that he did not mind the noise and the mess and the constant demands on his time. Every cry, every laugh, every milestone was a reminder of how lucky he was, how close he had come to missing all of this. When Sarah was 2 and Thomas was 3, they made a trip down to Greeley as a family. It was the first time Fiona had been back to the town since their wedding day, and as they rode down the main street, she looked around with new eyes. "It looks smaller than I remembered," she said. "Or maybe you have grown larger," Thaddeus suggested. "Not in size, but in spirit. You are not the same frightened, desperate woman who collapsed in this street 5 years ago." "No," she agreed, smiling. "I am not. That woman could not have imagined being this happy." They stopped in front of the general store, and Thaddeus helped Fiona down from the wagon while keeping an eye on Thomas, who was already trying to climb out on his own. Sarah slept peacefully in a sling across Fiona's chest, oblivious to the bustle around her. As they walked into the store, the proprietor looked up and did a double take. "Mrs. Owens, is that you?" "It is, Mr. Henderson," Fiona said warmly. The man shook his head in wonder. "I hardly recognized you. You look so different, so healthy and happy." "I am both of those things," she said. "Thanks to my husband." Mr. Henderson turned to Thaddeus and offered his hand. "I remember you. You were the mountain man who took her in. Best decision you ever made, I would wager." "Without question," Thaddeus agreed. As they shopped for supplies, Thaddeus noticed the way people looked at Fiona now. Not with pity or dismissal, but with respect and even a touch of envy. She carried herself with confidence, her head high and her shoulders back. She was dressed simply, in a practical calico dress and sturdy boots, but she moved with a grace and assurance that commanded attention. She wore rags no more. She had dirt under her nails still, from working in her garden and caring for her children and living a life of honest labor. But now everyone could see what he had seen that first day. They could see the Queen. Years continued to pass in the way years do, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas grew into a sturdy, serious boy who loved following his father into the woods and learning about trapping and tracking. Sarah was more like her mother, practical and organized, always trying to help with the household chores even when she was too small to be much use. When Thomas was 7 and Sarah was 6, Fiona gave birth to twins, boys they named James and Robert. The cabin was definitely too small now, so Thaddeus spent that summer building an addition, with help from Thomas, who was old enough to hand him tools and hold boards steady. The new room had bunks for the boys and extra storage space, and it finally gave the family room to breathe. Life was not always easy. There were winters when supplies ran low and everyone went to bed a little bit hungry. There were illnesses that frightened them, though thankfully none proved serious. There were arguments and frustrations, moments when the isolation of mountain living felt more like imprisonment than freedom. But through it all, Thaddeus and Fiona's love remained constant. They had built something together that went beyond romance, beyond passion. They had built a partnership founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. They knew each other's weaknesses and forgave them. They celebrated each other's strengths and relied on them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thaddeus took Fiona on a hike to a place he had discovered years before, a high meadow where wildflowers grew in profusion, and the view stretched for miles. They had left the children with a neighbor woman who had moved into a cabin a few miles away, part of the slow expansion of settlement into the mountains. They sat together in the meadow, holding hands and looking out at the world spread before them. "You ever regret it?" Thaddeus asked. "Marrying me, living up here, raising our children so far from civilization?" "Never," Fiona said firmly. "Not once. This life is hard, Thaddeus, I will not pretend otherwise, but it is also honest and real in a way nothing else has ever been. Every meal we eat we earned. Every log in that cabin you cut and shaped. Every stitch of clothing I sewed. Our children are growing up strong and capable, learning the value of hard work and the beauty of the natural world. What could I possibly regret about that? I just want to make sure you are happy," he said. "You have given up so much." "I have given up nothing that mattered," she said. "And I have gained everything. I have you, I have our children, I have a home and a life that fulfills me. I am exactly where I am meant to be." He pulled her close and kissed her, tasting the salt of her skin and the sweetness of her mouth. Even after 10 years, even after 4 children and countless challenges, his desire for her had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by the shared experiences and the knowledge that they had built something lasting together. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I loved you the first moment I saw you, though I did not know it then, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I will love you just as long," she whispered back. As their children grew older, Thaddeus and Fiona found themselves with more time to be just the two of them again. Thomas, now a teenager, was capable of watching his younger siblings for hours at a time. This allowed Thaddeus and Fiona to take long walks together, to ride out to check the trap lines as a pair, to rediscover the quiet companionship that had first drawn them together. They talked about everything and nothing. They planned for the future, discussing which of their children might want to stay on the mountain and which might be drawn to the growing towns in the valley. They remembered the past, laughing over mistakes they had made and marveling at how far they had come. "Do you remember that first meal I cooked for you?" Fiona asked one evening as they walked along the creek. "I was so nervous. I wanted it to be perfect, to prove that hiring me had been the right decision." "It was the best meal I had eaten in years," Thaddeus said. "Though truthfully, I would have eaten sawdust if it meant having you around." She laughed and swatted his arm. "You are a terrible liar, but I appreciate the sentiment." "I am serious," he said, catching her hand and pulling her to a stop. "From the very beginning, it was never just about the cooking or the cleaning. It was about you, about the light you brought into my life. I had been living in darkness for so long, I had forgotten what it was like to feel hope, and then you came along and reminded me." tears shimmered in her eyes. "You did the same for me. When you picked me up off that street, when you offered me a job and treated me with dignity and respect, you gave me back my humanity. I had started to think of myself as something less than human, just a burden to be tolerated or ignored. But you saw me as a person, as someone with value. That gift is beyond price." They stood there by the creek, holding each other as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The years had marked them both. Thaddeus's hair was streaked with gray now, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun. Fiona's hands were worn from work, her face more weathered than it had been when they first met. But to each other, they were as beautiful as they had ever been. When Thomas turned 18, he announced that he wanted to stay on the mountain and build his own cabin nearby. Thaddeus helped him select a good site and spent months working with his son to fell trees, shape logs, and build a sturdy structure that would last for generations. It was bittersweet, knowing his oldest child was starting his own life, but also deeply satisfying to see the young man Thomas had become. Strong, capable, and kind. Sarah, meanwhile, had developed a fascination with healing. She spent hours gathering herbs and making poultices, studying the medical knowledge that Mrs. Simmons had shared during her visits over the years. When she was 16, Fiona and Thaddeus arranged for her to apprentice with a doctor in Greeley, staying with a respectable family in town during the week and coming home on weekends. It was hard to have her gone so much, but they were proud of her ambition and determination. The twins, now 10, were still young enough to need their parents, and Fiona poured her energy into teaching them reading and arithmetic, and all the practical skills they would need to make their way in the world. One autumn evening, when the aspen were gold and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter, Thaddeus and Fiona sat on their porch watching the sun set. The twins were inside doing their lessons, and the house was unusually quiet. "It is strange," Fiona said thoughtfully. "When the children were small, I used to dream about having moments of peace and quiet like this. But now that we have them more often, I find I miss the chaos. We are getting old," Thaddeus said with a smile. "Soon we will be grandparents, sitting on this porch and telling stories about the old days. I look forward to it," she said, leaning against him. "Growing old with you has been the greatest adventure of my life." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Do you remember what you told me once, about your mother saying that a good meal nourished both body and soul?" "I do. I think the same is true of a good marriage. It nourishes you in ways that go beyond the practical. It feeds something deep inside that you might not even know was hungry until it is finally satisfied." "That is beautiful," Fiona said softly. "And true. You have fed my soul every day since we met, Thaddeus. You have made me feel valued and loved and cherished. What more could anyone ask?" "Nothing," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Absolutely nothing." The years continued their steady march. Thomas married a young woman from a neighboring homestead and gave Thaddeus and Fiona their first grandchild, a girl they named Alina. Sarah completed her apprenticeship and returned to the mountains to set up a small practice, serving the growing number of families who had settled in the area. The twins grew into young men, James with a talent for woodworking and Robert with a gift for working with horses. Through it all, Thaddeus and Fiona remained the center of their family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love for each other never wavered, never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, tempered by challenges and enriched by shared joys. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the cabin. All of them were there, along with grandchildren and friends from the surrounding area. There was music and dancing and more food than Fiona's table had ever held. At one point, Thaddeus stood up and raised his glass, calling for everyone's attention. "I am not much good at speeches," he began, his voice gruff with emotion, "so I will keep this short. 25 years ago, I rode into Greeley with no intention of changing my life. I was content to live alone, to avoid connections and complications. But then I saw a woman collapse in the street, and everything changed." He looked at Fiona, who was sitting beside him with tears already streaming down her face. "I saw a woman who wore rags and had dirt under her nails. But I also saw a queen. I saw strength and courage and dignity that no amount of hard luck could diminish. And I knew, even if I did not admit it to myself right away, that I had found something precious, something worth fighting for." He reached out and took her hand. "Fiona Fletcher Owens, you have been my wife, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. You have given me children and grandchildren, a home and a purpose. You have made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. And I want you to know that I would do it all again, every single moment, without changing a thing." There was not a dry eye in the room when he sat down. Fiona threw her arms around him, holding him tight as their family applauded and cheered. In that moment, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world, in the cabin they had built together in the mountains they called home, Thaddeus and Fiona knew that they had succeeded in the most important way possible. They had built a life of meaning and purpose. They had loved and been loved. They had raised good children who were going out into the world and making it better. They had proven that sometimes, against all odds, a mountain man and a woman who wore rags could find each other and build something beautiful together. As the celebration continued around them, Thaddeus and Fiona slipped outside for a moment alone. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air cold and clean and smelling of pine. They stood together in the clearing where Thaddeus had once watched Fiona split wood and realized he was falling in love. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For seeing me. Really seeing me, not just that day in Greeley, but every day since. For never letting me feel like I was less than I am. For building this life with me." "I should be thanking you," he said. "You are the one who took a chance on a lonely mountain man. You are the one who turned a cabin into a home. You are the one who gave me everything worth having." "Then we are even," she said with a smile. "No," he said, pulling her close. "I will never be even. I will always owe you more than I can repay. But I promise you, Fiona, I will spend the rest of my days trying." They kissed under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to their love and all the days they had shared. When they finally went back inside, hand in hand, their family welcomed them with cheers and laughter. The party continued late into the night, filled with music and dancing, and the kind of joy that comes from being surrounded by people who love you. And later, when everyone had gone home and the cabin was quiet again, Thaddeus and Fiona climbed up to their loft and lay together in the darkness, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he replied. "Always have, always will." They fell asleep in each other's arms, two people who had started with nothing and built everything, two souls who had recognized each other in the darkness and chosen to walk into the light together. The seasons continued to turn, as they always had and always would. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall. The mountains remained constant, but life within them continued to grow and change. Thomas and his wife had 3 more children, giving Thaddeus and Fiona a total of 4 grandchildren. Sarah married a young lawyer from Greeley and had twins of her own, though she continued her medical practice, traveling to homesteads throughout the area to provide care. James opened a furniture-making shop in Greeley, his pieces prized for their quality and craftsmanship. Robert started a horse breeding operation, developing a reputation for training animals that were both gentle and reliable. As Thaddeus and Fiona entered their 60s, they found themselves slowing down in ways that were both frustrating and inevitable. Thaddeus's joints ached in the cold, and he could no longer hike as far or work as long as he once had. Fiona's eyesight was not as sharp as it had been, and she tired more easily. But they adapted, finding new rhythms and accepting help from their children when it was offered. They spent more time sitting on the porch, watching their grandchildren play in the clearing. They told stories about the old days, about the winter the snow had been so deep they could not leave the cabin for a week, about the time a bear had tried to break into the root cellar, about the first time each of their children had taken their first steps. One warm summer afternoon, when Thaddeus was 70 and Fiona was 68, they walked down to the creek together. It had been their special place from the beginning, where they had shared so many important conversations over the years. They sat on a fallen log, their feet dangling over the water, and held hands in comfortable silence. "Do you have any regrets?" Fiona asked after a while. "Only one," Thaddeus said. "I regret that we will not have forever. I wish we had met when we were younger so we could have more time together." "We have had more than 40 years, she pointed out. "That is longer than many people get, and we have made the most of every day." "That is true," he acknowledged. "What about you? Any regrets?" "None," she said firmly. "My life has been exactly what it was meant to be. Hard sometimes, yes, but also rich and full and meaningful. I have loved deeply and been loved in return. I have raised children who make me proud. I have built a home and a life that matters. What could I possibly regret?" They sat quietly, listening to the water and the birds and the whisper of wind through the trees. After a while, Fiona spoke again, her voice soft and thoughtful. "You remember the day we met?" "Every detail," Thaddeus said. "You were lying in the street in Greeley, too weak to stand. You had dirt under your nails and your dress was more patches than fabric. But when you looked at me, I saw fire in your eyes. I saw determination and strength and a refusal to give up. I thought you were the biggest, most intimidating man I had ever seen," she said with a laugh. "All those muscles and that intense stare. But then you picked me up so gently and your voice was kind and I knew I was safe. You called me Mr. Owens," he remembered. "So formal and proper, even though you were starving. And you fed me. You bought me a meal when you had no reason to trust me or help me. That kindness changed my entire life." "No," Thaddeus said, squeezing her hand. "You changed your own life. I just gave you an opportunity. You are the one who took it and made something of it. You are the one who transformed a rough cabin into a home. You are the one who raised our children with wisdom and love. You are the one who made every day worth living. We did it together," she insisted. "That is what marriage is it not? Two people choosing each other day after day, year after year. Building something bigger than either could build alone." "Yes," he agreed. "That is exactly what it is." As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they walked slowly back to the cabin. Their steps were not as sure as they had once been, but they moved in perfect synchronization. Two people who had learned each other's rhythms so completely that they functioned as one. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Thomas came by to check on them. He was in his 40s now, with gray streaking his dark hair and the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. He had grown into a man very much like his father, strong, capable, and deeply devoted to his family. "How are you both feeling?" he asked, settling onto the porch steps. "Old," Thaddeus said with a wry smile, "but content." "Sarah wants to know if you will come to dinner on Sunday," Thomas said. "All the grandchildren will be there, and she is making your favorite pie." "We will be there," Fiona promised. "We would not miss it." After Thomas left, Fiona turned to Thaddeus. "We are so lucky," she said, "to have children who love us, grandchildren who want to spend time with us. So many people end up alone in their old age." "We are lucky," Thaddeus agreed, "but I think we also earned it. We showed our children what real love looks like. We taught them the value of family and commitment and hard work. They are good people because you made them good people." "We made them good people," she corrected. "Together, like everything else." Years continued to pass, though more slowly now. Thaddeus and Fiona celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a joyous occasion, though tinged with the awareness that their time together was growing shorter. Thaddeus's health began to decline in earnest when he was 75. His heart was not as strong as it had been, and Sarah warned him that he needed to take things easy. He grumbled about it but listened, knowing that Fiona would worry if he did not. He spent more time in his chair by the fire, less time out in the woods. But he still rose every morning to make coffee, still told stories to his great-grandchildren, still held Fiona's hand as they watched the sun set. One evening in late autumn, when the air was crisp and the stars were brilliant, Thaddeus and Fiona were alone in the cabin. The fire crackled cheerfully, and they sat together in the large chair Thaddeus had built decades ago, Fiona tucked against his chest. "I need to tell you something," Thaddeus said quietly. "What is it?" Fiona asked, though she thought she already knew. "I am tired, my love, so very tired, and I do not think I have much longer." She had known it was coming, but hearing him say it still made her heart clench. "Do not talk like that," she said, even though she knew it was futile. "We have to talk about it," he said gently. "I need you to know that I am not afraid. I have lived a full life, a good life. I have loved and been loved. I have watched my children grow and thrive. I have held my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. What more could any man want?" Tears streamed down her face. "I want more time with you. I want years and years more." "I know, love, I know, but we do not always get what we want. What we have had is more than most people ever dream of." "I do not know how to be without you," she whispered. "You will be fine," he assured her. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You survived when you had nothing. You thrived when others would have given up. You will survive this too, but I do not want to. I know. But you will, because our children and grandchildren need you, because there is still life to be lived and love to be shared. Promise me, Fiona. Promise me you will not give up." "I promise," she said, though the words felt like glass in her throat. They sat together through the night, holding each other, saying all the things that needed to be said, and many things that did not need to be said, because they had been said 1,000 times before in 1,000 different ways. They remembered their life together, from that first day in Greeley to this last night in their cabin. They laughed and cried and held each other close. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Thaddeus took a shuddering breath and looked at Fiona with eyes that still held all the love they had always held. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me," he said. "You made my life worth living." "And you saved mine," she said. "In every way a person can be saved." He smiled, that same gentle smile that had first made her feel safe all those years ago. Then his eyes closed and his breathing slowed, and Fiona held him as he slipped away, surrounded by the life they had built together. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. But Fiona kept her promise. She survived. She leaned on her children and let them care for her. She found comfort in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She continued to live in the cabin she and Thaddeus had shared, surrounded by memories of their life together. And every evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, she would sit on the porch in the chair they had shared so many times and talk to him, telling him about her day, about the family, about the way the aspens looked in the fall light. She knew he could not answer, but she also knew, deep in her heart, that he was listening. She lived for 5 more years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. When her own time came, she faced it without fear, knowing that she would soon be reunited with the man who had loved her, who had seen a queen when everyone else saw only rags and dirt. On a warm spring morning, Fiona Fletcher Owens passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Thaddeus had created. They buried her next to him on the hillside overlooking the cabin, where wildflowers grew, and the view stretched to the mountains they had both loved so much. At the funeral, Thomas stood before the assembled family and spoke about his parents. "They taught us what real love looks like," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the easy, romantic kind that you see in stories, but the real, lasting kind that survives hardship and grief and all the challenges life can throw at you. They taught us that where you come from does not matter as much as where you are going, that rags and dirt cannot hide the truth of who a person really is, that seeing and being seen is the greatest gift we can give each other." He paused, looking out at all the faces before him, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried Thaddeus and Fiona's legacy forward. "They started with nothing," he continued. "A mountain man who wanted to be alone and a woman who had lost everything, but they built this." He gestured to the family, to the cabin, to the life that spread out around them. "They built love and family and a home that will endure for generations, and that is the greatest accomplishment any person can achieve." The family stayed together through the afternoon, sharing stories and memories, laughing and crying, celebrating 2 lives that had been woven together so completely that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. As evening came and people began to drift away, the grandchildren lingered, not quite ready to leave the place where their grandparents had created so much love. Sarah, now in her 60s herself, stood looking at the cabin where she had grown up. "It feels empty without them," she said. "It does," Thomas agreed, "but their love is still here. It is in every log of this cabin, every tree in the clearing, every stone in the creek. They put their hearts into this place, and that does not just disappear." "What will happen to the cabin?" James asked. "We keep it in the family," Thomas said firmly. "We maintain it, care for it, pass it down. This is where it all started. This is where Papa brought Mama all those years ago and gave her a chance at a new life. We honor that. We remember that. And we teach our children and grandchildren about the 2 people who proved that love can triumph over any adversity." And so it was. The cabin remained in the family, maintained and cherished, a testament to 2 people who had found each other when they both needed saving. Over the years, it became a gathering place, a touchstone, a reminder of what could be built when 2 people chose to face life together. The story of Thaddeus and Fiona became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of how a mountain man had stopped to help a woman who wore rags and had dirt under her nails, how he had seen the queen beneath the struggle, how they had built a life and a love that endured long after they were gone. And in the mountains of Colorado, where the aspens still turned gold in autumn and the creeks still sang their ancient songs, the legacy of that love continued. Children played in the clearing where Thaddeus had built his cabin. Couples walked hand in hand along the trails he had carved. Families gathered around tables to share meals and stories, continuing the traditions Fiona had established so long ago. Because true love never really ends. It transforms, it evolves, it ripples outward like waves on water, touching lives and hearts for generations. And somewhere in those mountains, in the whisper of wind through the pines and the dance of sunlight on water, the spirits of Thaddeus and Fiona lived on, forever together, forever home. Their story was proof that sometimes, when you least expect it, life gives you exactly what you need. A chance meeting on a dusty street can change everything. A moment of kindness can alter the course of a life. And two people who seem to have nothing in common can discover that they have everything that matters: the courage to love, the strength to endure, and the wisdom to build something lasting together. That was the legacy of Thaddeus Owens and Fiona Fletcher. Not just the children they raised or the land they tended, but the example they set. The proof that real love sees past surfaces to the truth beneath. That dignity and worth are inherent, not bestowed by circumstance. That a queen can wear rags and dirt, and a rough mountain man can have the gentlest heart. Their love story began in struggle and hardship, but it bloomed into something beautiful and enduring. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the transformative power of love, and the simple truth that we all deserve to be seen for who we truly are. And so their story ends, not with sadness but with celebration. Not with loss but with gratitude for all the love they shared, all the moments they treasured, all the years they had together. They lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure as long as the mountains themselves. In the end, that is all any of us can hope for: to love and be loved, to build something lasting, to leave the world a little better than we found it. Thaddeus and Fiona did all of that and more. They proved that miracles happen every day, in the smallest acts of kindness and the greatest gestures of love. Their story is finished now, complete and whole, a circle closed. But their love continues, in the family they created, in the land they tended, in the hearts of all who knew them or heard their story. It continues in the mountains they loved, in the cabin they built, in the life they chose to share. That is the end of their tale, and it is a good end. A happy end. An ending that feels like a beginning, because love never truly ends. It just transforms into something new, something lasting, something eternal. And that is exactly as it should be.